Hello to all our fellow bibliophiles and lovers of the written word. This is Books in the World, sponsored by the Cape Cod Writers Center. And we have a very interesting guest with us today, whose book I enjoyed very much, because it's a different take on a problem that confronts all of us, which is the evils of addiction, but it's fictionalized. And so Sharon Leader, who is our guest, has done sort of a hybrid, I think. It's a book of fiction, but it has some real life elements. So I'm going to let Sharon tell us what made you decide to write not a memoir, but a work of fiction?
I decided to make a fiction out of my family story. It's based on my family story. But I found that writing details of my life, which really required quite a bit of revisiting of painful experiences given the nature of the topic, and all of the complications that the child's mind was trying to figure out, because this book is told from the child's point of view. And I also have understood from my own research that when you experience trauma, it's best to go to the site of the trauma rather than really filtering it as a way of understanding the authenticity of the experience. When I would go to that child's place, I was confronted with a mystery. I would never really find out the answer. And as a young child, what I wanted to know was, why did my father get addicted to heroin? And why couldn't he stop his addiction? And really, I couldn't figure that out at the time, and it's still a mystery. So it seems to me that a fiction allowed me to depart from the truth, so I wouldn't be limited by the truth or the truth of what I knew. And yet perhaps I could get to the essence of the truth, how I was feeling as a little child, how afraid I was, how terrorized I was.
You know, how did your family react when they found out you were writing a book about something that was painfully close to reality? I mean, families react when it's fiction, it has nothing to do with them. But how did your family react to that very personal aspect of the novel that you wrote?
I didn't really start writing this novel until well into my adulthood. And as I said, the pain of trauma was very difficult. So I filtered the story. It started out as a very, very different story. The book that we read today has gone through many, many revisions.
How so? How is it different now from what you started?
Well, I started writing it in the middle of my career as a teacher of women's studies, literature, and Jewish studies. And it seemed to me that my career was being blocked by certain traumas that I was still experiencing in the workplace. And so I began writing it as a teacher, having flashbacks of her childhood. And I circulated this manuscript to agents, and the agents' feedback in a pattern was that the point of view did not seem right. There wasn't a great deal of sympathy for the teacher. They thought that perhaps if I began the book from the child's point of view, that my message would come across more directly, that the character would be more convincing. And it could be that I wasn't experienced enough as a novel writer to engage in those flashback techniques, because I authentically was having difficulty in my job. But nevertheless, I wasn't able to get to the feeling dimension. However, when I showed my original book to my mom, who was really a survivor of this trauma, and to my sister and brother, they encouraged me.
Oh, really?
They encouraged me to go forward. My mother did, and my sister especially. My brother, in the process of my writing the book and changing to the child's point of view, my brother has a family of his own, 2 growing boys, a wife, and an extended family on his wife's side. He began to express apprehensions.
Yeah.
So going in fiction was the right direction for me.
You know, it's interesting. Sharon and I were talking, and I think one of the aspects of The Fix, which is her book, that people need to realize is it's a very entertaining and engrossing novel. So it's not some kind of preachy tome which, which makes you not saying, I don't need this. We really get involved in the life of this child and see the kind of trauma that the parent to whom you look for everything, right? When that parent does not deliver it, what does that do to the child?
Well, first let me say that I had a great deal of commitment to creating a book that people would want to read. And what I learned was all the flashbacks that I had in my original book, if I could string them together and put them in a kind of dramatic escalator, that would
I like
make
that, dramatic escalator. Good,
yeah,
good.
yes.
We're going to steal that one, Sharon.
If I could build up the tension until I got to a turning point, then maybe I could make an interesting read. And so I'm glad if readers find it engaging. I wanted very much to, as I say, engage the reader. And I'm trying to get back to your original question. How did it make the child feel? The first way I felt really was abandoned, unloved, and responsible. I felt as a child, if I was not loved by my dad, what was I doing wrong? What did I have to do in order to gain his love? Also, to make matters worse, when this issue of my father's addiction became out in my family, when it was outed, because my mom did not know until I was 8 years old, and she learned, and she shared the information with me. Everyone wanted to pass the blame onto someone else. And one of the blames fell on my father's mom, my grandmother. And when my grandmother learned that my father was addicted, she began to blame my mother. And so my mother then felt a terrible burden. She shared her burdens with me. I was the oldest child in the family. And my grandmother, who saw me as the oldest and who believed that something was wrong in the family, my father's family, the primary family, that I could fix it because I was the oldest daughter and my father would never do anything to hurt me. So she said to me, Sharon, talk to your father. You can stop him from continuing his addiction. And believe me, I felt this was a tremendous task. I was so confused.
Oh, for a kid. Now, if you were to tell our viewers, if you were to give a capsule version of the story in The Fix, can you do that for us?
Yeah, the story is about Sarah Katz learning that her dad is doing something bad, heroin addiction. She doesn't even know what heroin is at 8 years old, but she knows it's terrible, and she knows it has to be kept a secret because her mom says don't tell anyone. It will ruin our reputation in our family. If it spills out in school, the teachers and your students won't feel kindly towards you. It'll hurt you. And my grandmother thought it was a terrible shanda, which means shame in the Jewish community in Yiddish. And so Sarah knew that she had to keep something troubling inside of her. And she watched as her mother and her grandmother primarily tried to help her father fix his addiction. He was very reluctant because he felt it would hurt him too in his business. My father was indeed a kosher butcher, and that's what Sarah Katz's father is in the novel. And so clandestinely, they tried all these different cures, which were experimental at the time. So the novel goes through Sarah's reaction to all the different cures that Joseph Katz has. The first is at the Veterans Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. It was for veterans of World War II, and cold turkey was the treatment. So she watched as her father went through cold turkey. They got letters, they got calls. He came home after 8 months. He was still addicted because they didn't really treat him in any way. He was left really essentially on his own. And he watched other people in the hospital die from heart attacks and strokes. He went then to a psychotherapist in Manhattan who was himself addicted. And so my father's trust in this individual was lost. My father continued on heroin. His connections were in Manhattan and in Harlem, and this is depicted in the novel. Psychotherapy resulted in his larger and larger habit. His parents, my grandmother, my grandfather, decided that this was no good. They tried to find some other cure that was available at the time, and that was electroshock therapy. Again, experimental. I watched my father go through this. Sarah watches her dad in the novel go through this. And all of these so-called cures wind up to be inept. They're not working. Sarah Katz's father loses lots of his memory, but not his taste for the pleasure or the reward of heroin.
And that's interesting, because so even though you might lose other vital parts of your life, the one thing you would want to lose is not there. Can you tell the audience, if you were to give a thumbnail sketch of Mr. Katz, what's he like as a person? If we were to meet him, what would we see?
Well, we'd see a charming, happy-go-lucky man who enjoyed playing harmonica jazz. He is very, very well-versed treating his customers and the different restaurant owners where he delivers corned beef and pastrami. He is a lovable character in the street, but privately he's beset with so many different insecurities about what is going to happen to the kosher meat business given the development of supermarkets everywhere. He's very worried about the conditions that his family has to live with. When he was a teenager, even before he was married, he was a very sensitive young man. He was aware that his relatives were still in Europe suffering when fascism came to power. He was very concerned about cousins that he had who had gone through the Holocaust. He was a very sensitive young man, maybe we would even say super sensitive. And so in his growing up, as my mother told me about him, he was beloved in the family. He was beloved as his father was a kosher butcher, and he used to work in his father's store, and the neighbors would come in and ask him to write letters to their relatives overseas. So there was a very benign side to this man. However,
we would like him. If we met him, he's the kind of fellow we'd want to invite over, and he would entertain. And okay, give me a portrait of Sarah's mom.
Sarah's mom was very much in love with Joseph Katz. They met when they were teenagers. She was a upright young woman who wanted to find a partner who loved life and who could make a good life for her, who could help her raise a family. She was traditional, but she also noticed that this Joseph Katz, and my mom noticed this about my dad, he had some interesting risk-taking behaviors. And this leads us into the other Joseph Katz that young Sarah discovers when she learns he has a heroin addiction. He believes that the path to success is not really in the conventional way. He believes that the path to success is breaking out of a confining, small-knit Jewish community and becoming Americanized and leading the path of people who become rich and famous. He wanted to open his own business. He wanted to become more than just the local kosher butcher. He wanted to have his business be the major distributor for kosher and deli products all across Manhattan. And my mother was attracted to this type of person. When he experienced the high that he got from playing jazz harmonica, he decided—
I've never heard of jazz harmonica.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, in his day, there were many very interesting jazz harmonica groups that played on TV. And my father was interested in auditioning for these groups and hoped someday to make a movie with them. So he becomes a little bit of a flamboyant character.
So he's very aspirational then.
Exactly. He's a risk taker. He's also a social climber. And when he sees that he has some success playing jazz harmonica at a time in New York City, where the novel takes place, when there's a great deal of pressure leading up to World War II, when there's a big depression, he got a lot of satisfaction from playing in jazz clubs and being recognized by Harlem musicians as being a good harmonica player. And as a result, he became a truant from school. And my mother didn't learn this until it was quite advanced, and a truant officer visited his family and said he's not graduating. What was he doing? He was building a club room in his neighborhood where young people could come, dance, jam with their instruments, drink, smoke reefer. And my mother was really shocked at this behavior. She knew her own parents wouldn't ever allow her to do it. And she cut off the relationship with my dad, but he was relentless with her.
Kind of, you know, that attraction of the bad boy, right? That a lot of us find very attractive, that aspect of him, the dangerous part of it.
Yes. But of course, as a child, I didn't know about this dangerous part. I saw the dad who was the loving dad, who was liked by the community. And when my mom confronted him about his heroin addiction, another dad came out. A dad who felt very threatened and frightened. A dad who felt that all of the flaws that you have when you have a large ego began being revealed. And one of those ego characteristics is to say to the family, I know when I'm good and ready to stop. And the laws are not right. The laws ought to allow for the legalization of this substance. And I feel better when I'm taking this substance. And if my mother tried to prevent him from getting sicker and sicker and hiding the funds that he needed to get his fix, he became abusive.
And what was the effect on the other siblings in Sarah's family? I mean, Sarah has this burden, she's the eldest, but what about the others, seeing their dad in this?
Well, I have a brother who's 3 years younger. I have a sister who's 10 years younger. The sister was really just a baby when my dad's problem was revealed. But my brother, I think, was very reliant on me for protection and for filtering the situation. My brother learned a lot from me as a model. And so when I became upset and I had bad dreams and nightmares and I would share them with him, he would close his eyes, he would grab onto what psychologists call his transitional object, which happened to be a blanket that was his favorite blanket, and he would need the security of things to help him adjust. I think both of us, my brother and myself, used school as an escape. This is when we felt that in school, if we focused and concentrated and forgot about the problems at home, that we could accomplish something in our lives and that maybe we could feel rewarded in positive ways, getting the gold stars. But I think that in a way it was an escape, and today I feel badly for youngsters who are going through some of the same issues, because school oftentimes is a place of greater stress today than it may have been back then in the 50s when we were youngsters.
Now in your book, we see that Sarah as she progresses, you know, through childhood, and what happens with her dad? I mean, what's the outcome?
Well, Sarah constantly has it in her mind that she needs to fulfill her grandmother's command, shall we say, that she speak to her father. And her father is unreliable. She'll never know if she approaches him, if he's going to be the loving dad or if he's going to be the dad who is a monster, who's unpredictable. So she's never able to really speak to him in the way that she wants. And as a result, she carries with her a great deal of regret and guilt. She feels she's never able to fulfill what she should be doing as a child. Even though she knows that it's impossible, she feels she needs to do it. She watches her father go through all these so-called treatments that are ineffective, and then her parents leave for the geographical cure. They go to Florida thinking a vacation, a change of place is going to do something, and she feels even more abandoned. She wonders, are her parents going to abandon her? And when they finally return and her father is still ill, Florida was the worst place to go. It was one of the sites where drug trafficking deposited all the heroin.
Really? I mean,
and so
Miami?
Yes, this was Miami. My dad was playing in clubs down there, even though that was not why he went down there. And so he came back really more addicted than when he left. And as a consequence, Sarah watches, and this Sharon watched her father go downhill and got more and more ill until the family stepped in. My grandparents, Sarah's grandparents, decided that my mother was totally ineffective in handling the problem, and the father needs to live with his parents. He needs to be taken out of the household. The only thing they think that will cause Joseph Katz to change his behavior pattern will be losing his family. And yes.
Well, you know, your book is a family saga, and I thought that was the point that readers might be most interested in, that it's about a problem, obviously, which is heroin addiction, but it also has a broader implication for what does any kind of abuse of this type do to the family.
Yes, and of course it raises many questions. One is, when should a child learn about a parent's problem if the problem is addiction? And what kind of guidance is necessary? In my case, my mom did the best she could, thinking that she should be both a father and a mother to her children. She also tried to shield her child from further victimization by keeping a secret. In her day, she thought keeping secrets would be a protective thing to do and benefit the child. But of course, I think today our attitudes are more enlightened, and we know that professionals are necessary in order to psychologically present information step by step in ways that children can handle. And so I think Sarah was very overwhelmed, and the family has been interpreted, those who have read it, to say that it was dysfunctional, in that both my grandmother and my mom did not want my dad to hit his bottom. They did not want him to be left out on the street, helpless. They felt that it was always necessary to provide a home for him, to provide funding if he was using up his money on his habit, which was quite expensive. It was actually ruining the family economically. So we all felt...
Yeah, we talked about that too,
Yes.
because Sharon and I talked before we started about, you know, on Cape Cod in particular, we know that there's an opioid problem. We both watched the film Heroin Cape Cod, which was very illuminating. And so there'd be a lot of people who would understand Sarah's issues because they're facing it themselves, whether it's in their own family or even personally.
Yes, and that film was very transformational for me, Heroin Cape Cod, USA. I watched the preview of it at the Cape Cod Community College, and in that film you watched 7 brave young people who were willing to allow the filmmaker to document their lives while they were addicted. And you saw that they credited their families with being good families. They were good kids and good families. And they were communicating the message it could happen to any of us. And essentially, that's how my dad felt.
I was thinking about that with your mother and your grandmother saying we have to provide him with a home and keep him, you know.
Yes, they didn't want to give him unnecessary suffering. Meanwhile, he never himself took responsibility for needing help. He believed it was under control. He always felt as long as he had his substance, he could function. And I think that that's an unfortunate thing. I think that in Heroin Cape Cod, USA, we see that youngsters feel they need and they accept the fact that their lives are out of control.
I want to make sure in our remaining time that we get to this point. What do you hope will emerge from your book? What is your, because we talked about it and you have some rather interesting plans about your book.
Yes, well, thank you, Arlene, for asking me about that. You know, I think it's an unfortunate coincidence that I finished writing my novel at a time when the opioid crisis was in full bloom on the Cape, in Massachusetts, and in the nation, and probably this is a global problem as well. I realized that it was important for me to come forward and to say that our times are more enlightened. We have so many more treatments that are available today. The only thing that hasn't changed is the shame and the stigma that's associated with this problem. Many people are not willing, like my family, to come forward. So I decided to start the Fix Fund. All the proceeds of my novel, all the proceeds of my talks go to the Fix Fund, a nonprofit fund which is devoted to helping all the projects underway on the Cape to help the problem.
Oh, that's wonderful. And how can we get more information, Sarah? How can our audience, if they want to contribute or learn more about the Fix Fund, your website?
Yes, you could go to 508-896-2395, my telephone number. Please call me. You can also go to SharonLeader.com, which is my website.
It's a good website, too. I know I scrutinized it.
Thank you.
And before we're wrapping up now, but I think the story that Sharon has for us is one that there is no real ending to it, and the kind of guidance that, in addition to what we've seen today, I think you will enjoy reading it and profit from reading The Fix. And Sharon, I want to thank you for being our guest.
And October 18th, Wednesday night, from 6 to 8:30 p.m. at Nauset Middle School, there'll be a film which is an antidote to Heroin Cape Cod, USA. It's called Generation Found. What can we do about the problem? And learn more about the Fix Fund.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who's watching.
Thank you.